And now I am joined by Garrett McQueen, executive producer and co host of the Triloquy podcast and president of Trillworks Media. Garrett, thank you so much for being here. How has classical music intersected with activism? Because that's surprising for a lot of folks.
Yeah, the intersection of black activism and classical music is a very long history filled with the names of far more people that I could share with you here today, but I'll offer a few examples of what this has looked like over the past couple centuries and how it all remains relevant today. So, first and foremost, I have to acknowledge that activism among classical musicians predates Black Lives Matter, it predates the civil rights movement, and even America as a country. Way back around the year of 1729, there was a man born on a slave ship headed from the African continent to England. His name was Ignatius Sancho. Now, Ignatius would grow up to be one of the leading figures in the abolitionist movement over in England and was even the very first black person to vote in a British election back in 1774. So, in addition to being that sort of activist and even an author, Ignatius Sancho was a composer of a vast number of compositions for string orchestra. Now, these pieces weren't regularly performed for many, many, many years, but today there are ensembles all around the world that use his music as a means of remembering the slave trade as a global scourge, not just one that impacted the United States. It's a dark part of our human history that was overcome through the work of all sorts of people, musicians included. Now, if you fast forward about 100 years or so, you can find another black Briton whose work lived at the intersection of classical music and activism. He was a man named Samuel Coleridge Taylor. He only lived to be 37 years old, but he managed to get a lot done in his relatively short life. First and foremost, Samuel Coleridge Taylor was a broadly respected composer in his own right. He had a number of pieces that really hit big back in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. One of those works was called Hiawatha's Wedding Feast. That work was such a big hit that it led him to an American tour so that he could learn more about the diaspora, and that fed into his beliefs when it comes to black people and black civil rights. In the year of 1900, he was the youngest participant at the first Pan-African Conference, and then in 1904, he was received by President Roosevelt at the White House, which, as everyone can imagine, was pretty revolutionary in itself for a black man back in those days. Today, his music continues to be performed and celebrated, and in my opinion, his music serves as one of the greatest artifacts that we have when it comes to exploring the intersectional history of Pan-African thought and Western classical music. Now, of course, it wasn't just the men who were doing the good work over history. In 1913, a woman named Margaret Bonds was born. Her father was an activist and her mother was a musician, so she grew up thinking about those ideas in tandem. Her most famous work is a tune that many folks know called He's Got the Whole World in His Hands, but a work that lots of folks are returning to by Bonds these days is her 1964 Montgomery Variations. This work was written in honor of Martin Luther King Jr. and the tireless work done by black folks down in Alabama fighting for civil rights and specifically voting rights. She also has a Christmas oratorio called The Ballad of the Brown King, which is also beginning to get more and more play in concert settings. Now, I would be remiss if I didn't mention Margaret Bonds' teacher, the folks she learned music from. As an aside, I was really lucky to get to study with someone black in the early years of my development, and so was Margaret Bonds. It proved very impactful. As a high school student, Margaret Bonds studied piano and composition with two black musicians, in fact, a man named William Levy Dawson and a black woman named Florence Price. So I'd like to share a short excerpt from a holiday show that I produced for Kwanzaa back in 2020 to give everyone a taste of her music. This excerpt features a bit of Florence Price's single movement piano concerto as performed by the Chicago Sinfonietta featuring pianist Karen Walwyn.
Very beautiful, Garrett McQueen. Let me ask you how the continued legacy of racial justice and activism in classical music is being engaged today, if it is.
Yeah, it's very important to understand that the work of fighting for Black rights through Western classical music has never died, thankfully. So, and there are many ensembles, institutions, and even more individuals who are continuing this fight. So, I'll name a few here. The first group I have to name is the Gateways Festival Orchestra. The Gateways Music Festival was founded back in 1993 in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, by Arminta Hummings Dumasani. The inaugural concert actually included a violin concerto featuring Louis Farrakhan on solo violin, something that a lot of folks don't know. Well, Arminta later took the organization to Rochester, New York in 1995 when she became an associate professor at the Eastman School of Music, and the group has been going strong up in Rochester ever since. In addition to the Gateways Music Festival, I have to mention the incredible work that's been happening in the world of opera, including the Metropolitan Opera's premiere of Fire Shut Up in My Bones, which marked their very first staging of an opera by a Black composer last year. I had the great pleasure of flying to New York and seeing it myself. Now, on the activist side of opera, I'm really proud to be a leadership council member of the Black Opera Alliance, which works to get more Black voices, more Black perspectives, and even more Black compositions on opera stages across the country, just so that things like that isn't a one-off, but something that becomes really normalized in the field. You have other organizations similar to the Black Opera Alliance that have remained active, including the International Society for Black Musicians, whose mission is to cultivate an international community of Black musicians through education, performance, collaboration, and the advancement of their work, and to facilitate the unlearning of centered whiteness in the scholarship of music, specifically classical music. Additionally, institutions like the American Composers Forum and New York's own American Composers Orchestra have shifted in recent years toward racial equity. So it's really exciting and there's a lot going on.
Let me ask you how people can help to continue the momentum of achieving racial equity in the world of classical music.
Yeah, that's a really big question, but what I see as the greatest means of continuing the momentum is acknowledging the Negro spiritual as America's first classical music. We have to understand that, with the exception of musical traditions codified by indigenous people, there's really nothing more musically American than the spiritual. So, as the spiritual evolved over the generations, it was separated from the musical traditions codified by folks who were not Black and in turn deemed as something different than classical music. But I believe that we all have to reconsider Black music in all of its iterations since the spiritual as something classical. Not only will this inspire more Black activism from more of our communities, but it'll also transform the genre of so-called classical music, as I like to say, into something that reflects more of who we are as a human race today and in the future.